Back in 2004, I stumbled upon a browser-based MMORPG called Runescape. I was already familiar with the concept of an MMORPG because I had recently played through .hack Infection, but that was just a single-player game that simulated an MMORPG, but RuneScape was the real deal, and man, it lived up to the hype. There was something so immersive and captivating about making my way through a persistent world with other real human beings going about their own adventures. Sure, it wasn't the most visually appealing game, but that didn't really matter to me, and I was able to lose myself in the world. And not long after my introduction to RuneScape, I was reading my monthly Shonen Jump magazine when I came across an ad for Ragnarok Online. And being a major weeb at the time, the anime art style immediately drew me in. And that night I installed the client on our family computer and made my cute little novice. So the next day at school, I convinced my friends to join me and download Ragnarok Online. And from that point on, we would spend most of our evenings exploring the world of Rune Midgards together. And now, instead of sending each other rather pointless messages on AIM, we had concrete objectives to accomplish when we played together, like grinding mobs or searching for rare items, passing our job change tests, or defending our guild's Imperium. Every time I logged in, I was excited for whatever adventure awaited me. These years of my life were filled with so many fond memories, and they had a big influence on my goals as a game developer. That's pretty much why every game I work on, I try to add a multiplayer component. In my opinion, playing a game with friends is almost always a better experience than playing a game alone. But I've never made anything as ambitious as an MMORPG until now. So introducing my next game, Rocket League the MMO, or it might just be a micro multiplayer online game, but I'll talk about that later. So why a Rocket League MMO? Well, besides my aforementioned love of MMORPGs, I've noticed that when I've been testing out new game engine features in my Rocket League demo project, I would often find myself playing the game long after I've already tested what I needed to test. It's just plain fun to control a rocket car, and it made me think, how fun would it be to control a Rocket League car in a more open game world instead of always being locked in to a sweaty competitive match? So, imagine this. Imagine an open world game where your player pawn, or your avatar, is a rocket car. You have a turret mounted onto your car that acts like your main auto attack, and instead of locking onto the ball with ball cam, you lock onto enemies instead. You find items and equipment through your journey, and they make you stronger, and some equipment might give you new abilities, for instance, a skill shot projectile, or landmines, or a temporary buff, or invisibility, something like that. Basically your run-of-the-mill MMO abilities. However, you can also find equipment that affects your mobility. For example, a tire upgrade could increase your turning, or increase your max movement speed, or maybe give you the ability to double jump. And maybe for the first several levels you don't even have a booster, but once you do find your first booster, it suddenly unlocks new areas to explore, kind of like a Metroidvania game. And maybe your first booster might have a very low fuel capacity and a low recharge rate, but you'll eventually find better upgrades as you progress through the game, and maybe even like a glider that lets you fly. I imagine like at endgame, you might get to the point where your mobility is so good that it just trivializes the platforming challenges in the game. But at that point, I think if you made it that far, it's actually like a really cool reward. But anyway, about the combat. I think getting the combat to feel good will probably be tricky. I imagine most enemies will need to have ranged attacks, otherwise kiting mobs would probably be too easy. And giving some enemies telegraphed special attacks might keep the combat fresh, and there's a possibility for cool platforming challenges during boss fights. So I can see a lot of potential for it, but I think the important thing for me right now is to first focus on a prototype that I can test the combat and game loop in and see if it can actually be fun. So now that I've explained the goal, let me show you the progress I've made so far and the giant mountain of work ahead of me. I started by porting over my rocket car code to a new project, and I removed most of the Sakar specific code. Then I spent some time figuring out how to make a large-scale world, and I decided to do all of the terrain sculpting in Blender, and I chose a world size of 4 kilometers by 4 kilometers, split into an 8x8 grid. And I wrote a script to make the exporting process quick, since I'll probably need to iterate it on it several times. And To be honest, I think it might be worth it to make an in-engine terrain sculpting feature, but for now I'm just going to stick to the Blender export workflow, but we'll see about that in the future. Anyway, then I wrote some code for managing the different cells, which is what I'm calling each subdivision of the world. For now, all 64 cells are loaded in memory, but only the nearest 9 cells are rendered and updated. On the server though, we will need to tick or update any cell that is within the 9 nearest cells to each client. I will need to eventually load and unload those scenes too to free up memory. And then I made some textures and models. I painted the terrain, made a sky sphere, and then added some placeholder enemies. I just used a model from my card battler game, Renji Monsters, for now. But look, you can lock onto enemies like you would the ball in Rocket League, and my plan is to be able to use the right stick to change targets if needed. And like I said before, most enemies are going to have ranged attacks because it might be possible to move very quickly depending on your gear. I haven't tweaked any of the speed, acceleration, or handling of the car yet from my Rocket League demo project, that is, but I will definitely mega nerf the starting speed, but also probably greatly increase the turning speed so it feels a little better moving around. So yeah, that's pretty much where I am right now. There's still so much more work to do, and it's kind of stressful, but I'm trying to enjoy the journey while developing this game, and that's why I'm making these devlogs. And I know an MMO is actually pretty unrealistic, but I want to at least make a micro multiplayer online game where maybe like 16 players can exist in the same world. I really want this game to run on the 3DS, so in that case maybe only like 4 players can play together, especially if like the 3DS is the host. I think like worst case, maybe all 4 players would have to stay within a certain distance of the main host just to make sure that only those 9 cells are loaded and ticking for the server if it's the 3DS. But actually I take that back. Worst case scenario is that I just totally scrap the 3DS version. I mean, I really love the challenge of developing for 3DS, but if it becomes a massive headache, I might drop it. But let me know if you have strong feelings about this, and aside from 3DS, the other platforms would just be Windows and Linux. But before I end the video, let me just show you some new features I've added to the game engine. You can now paint vertex colors on static meshes. You can use this feature for painting lighting or use it for painting texture blending weights like I'm doing for the terrain in this game. You can also now paint instance meshes. It's a bit limited, but it's good for painting things like grass or flowers, pebbles, things like that. Instance rendering isn't supported on the consoles like GameCube or 3DS, so for those platforms, the instance meshes will actually be unrolled when you package your game. I divide the bounds of the instance mesh into patches of a configurable size, and then each patch has new static mesh data created for it and is rendered as a normal static mesh node. It's not optimal, but it doesn't kill performance depending on how you configure it, because I also added distance culling. So now you can set a cull distance on any primitive node, so we stop rendering meshes that are far away. And the last big feature I added is Steam support. So now you can create lobbies and invite friends or join friends' games. And this feature requires compiling the engine from source and dropping your own download of the Steam SDK in the proper folder, but it is hooked up in the engine, and it's pretty cool. So for my next devlog, it's probably going to be a while from now, and before I do any more work on my game, I want to write up Lua documentation for my engine, and like documentation that you can access from the web, like a real game engine should have. And by the way, my game engine is called Octave, and it's a cross-platform 3D engine, and it runs on GameCube, Wii, 3DS, Android, Windows, and Linux. And it's designed to make game development for retro consoles fast by letting you play and test on PC, and then deploy it later to the consoles. And hopefully it would just work, but you know. It's available on GitHub if you're interested, and you can check out the link in the description. And yeah, that's it. So thanks for watching, guys. Like I said, next devlog will be a while from now, but I might upload some other videos before then. Also might stream some engine development on Twitch. My handle there is Dinglemancer also, but that might be fun, and if people have questions or want to like recommend stuff for the game engine, that would be a cool place to do that. Yeah, so thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.